Hello and welcome to AIL TV, but most importantly, welcome to Security Update. You have just heard in the news what has happened in Reading, England, but it is not me who's going to be talking about it. I have got a man who is an expert in security or terrorism counter. How do you call it, David? David is our man to. David is our man to talk about all this. You are on.
Yes. Thank you, Joseph. And once more, we want to welcome the people that have taken their time to follow us on Africans in London television. This is a special update program that we often do on Thursdays, but we also have these programs when there is an incident that has something to do with counterterrorism or terrorism, but especially when it concerns Africa. Because just yesterday, the 20th of June, we had an attack which took place in Reading, in the United Kingdom of Great Britain, and that attack, as we know it now, was launched by an individual, 25 years old, Saadallah Khairi Abdullah, from an early indication. We understand that this individual comes from Libya, and as we know, Libya is a country in North Africa, and that gives us. As Africans in London, we have to talk about this. We have to talk about, the dynamics of this attack, the significance of it, especially talking about a period when we are experiencing the pandemic, which is the COVID-19 pandemic. And the lockdown measures were set in by the government in March of 2020. We've now been, in a situation where these lockdown measures have been relaxed, only to have this incident happen in Reading. So we will be talking about, the individual dynamics, especially from the point of the terror triangle, which, we've often talked about in sense of, the attack dynamics of the individual motivation. Who motivated this individual to carry out the attack? How did he obtain his weapon of choice? We know that he used a knife. Where did he get it from? Of course, we've got to look at the particular incident in terms of the target, which is the vulnerable population. People that are going about their daily businesses and their daily lives, were attacked. We know that 3 people were killed in this particular attack, and 3 others were seriously injured. So first of all, us at Africans in London TV, as Africans in general, we want to express, our sincere condolences to the families that have been bereaved, that have lost, their loved ones, during this attack. We want to share our greatest sympathy with those who have been injured, during this attack, but also those that witnessed the attack, because, oftentimes we talk about attacks in the sense of physical, some physical pain, but, there are people who leave these kind of environments with psychological damages. And this is a key area which we must also look into. People that have been impacted psychologically, either by witnessing this attack or by being, part of the families of the people that, have lost their lives. So it's quite important that we look at these various victims, of terror-related attacks. As we know, the UK counterterrorism police has now declared that it's a terror incident. Before, of course, due to the circumstances under which the attack happened, when we just had the Black Lives Matter protest, in Reading just hours after that. So there has been some talk about whether this attack has any links to do with the Black Lives Matter. But, we know from what the UK counterterrorism police, have put up, especially the Thames Valley Police, that this attack, first of all, has nothing to do with the Black Lives Matter movement. Of course, the ideological concept of this attack is one thing that we will touch, when we're talking about the attack dynamics. The other area that we would also look at is to see if this attack had anything to do with the lockdown measures, because there's been a lot of concern that a lot of people that have been locked, on lockdown in the UK or elsewhere, have experienced so much trauma. But also, they've been exposed to a lot of online materials. They've been flooded with radicalization from jihadist organizations who have taken advantage of that. So we'll look at the impact of that. But lastly, we would also look at the connection between attacks which are inspired, attacks which are enabled, but also attacks that are being connected, to jihadist organizations. So we will look at these elements and see how this fits into this particular incident. Was the attack directed by maybe an Islamic State organization, or was it enabled by them, or was this attack a simple attack of an individual who was inspired? So let's talk about these dynamics.
So, David.
Yeah. Yes,
I know you have covered a lot of ground there. But what I want really to ask you as a man who has got experience in these matters, do you think that the terrorists have used this COVID-19 to re-energize and even strategize, or in fact even to plan more precisely? Because just this one here, it just took people by surprise. The guy walked into the park, nobody suspected it. But most importantly, what I'm hearing from the news, they're saying this man is known to MI5. So what do you think that is the British intelligence community, is it relaxed, or do not believe that these guys they have got on their books cannot cause havoc?
I think what is important to note is that especially when we're talking about this COVID-19 era, there has been a lot of people, again, as I mentioned, that have been isolated, and this period of COVID-19 means that they've been exposed to a lot of materials. And what jihadist organizations like ISIS has done, the Islamic State of West Africa province in Africa has done the same. Al-Shabaab in Somalia has also done the same. What they've done is to use these COVID-19 pandemic lockdown measures to radicalize people online, just to flood the online messaging, with disinformation, with misinformation, with fake news, with Islamic jihadist materials targeted towards the most vulnerable individuals. And this has been done specifically to recruit a lot of people online. So, what we don't know so far is whether this particular individual may have been a victim of this propaganda material. So we don't know that yet, but I'm sure that as more information comes up, we will be able to know again the source of the radicalization, the source of this motivation, whether it had something directly, of course, to do with the COVID-19 lockdown. Again, when it comes to counterinsurgency or counterterrorism, as you're dealing with an environment which is very asymmetric. It's a very horizontal environment, which means no matter how much measures that the UK counterterrorism efforts are placed, of course, with taking into consideration the challenges, when it comes to trying to identify vulnerable individuals. So you would find that there are more than somehow a huge number of propaganda material that goes online. I mean, the UK counterterrorism units, they stop. They have about 600 or more counterterrorism investigations at any one time. And, there are more than 3,000 suspects, the last time I checked, in terms of, the people that the UK government and the counterterrorism units have that they've got to check each and every time. And you can understand the enormous amount of, work that requires. And, more than 20,000 people also are a major cause for concern, which, they are seen as individuals of interest related to counterterrorism. Again, Mr. Joseph, what we need to understand, as I mentioned earlier on, the proliferation of misinformation and disinformation has never been seen before. At the rate at which we've seen during this COVID-19 pandemic. So there has been a lot of work involved in trying to remove radical materials from the internet. But once you remove one of them, I bet you these guys have the capacity to put about more than 20 or 100 of them back on the internet. So these are some of the challenges that is important to note, especially when it comes to trying to detect whether somebody is going through a process of radicalization. But you're right. He has been on the radar of MI6 or the UK police. But what we've got to understand is, even though he's been on the radar and he's said to have been in prison, this had nothing to do with whether he's counterterrorism. It wasn't counterterrorism related. It was something of a minor offense. So it is difficult to then try and link that up, and that is why. Generally, the period between which somebody tends to become a criminal to a radical, is a very, very tiny, very, very tiny, kind of barrier, if you want to use that word. So, it's difficult for the police to really know, but that's why they will always talk about the need to build community resilience. See something, say something. We get people to understand and to try and understand the behavior changes of individuals.
Okay.
Try and understand changes in mindset.
Yeah. Sorry, just to interrupt you. I know we are having your line is not actually as clear, and it seems to be having a little bit of problem connecting. So I don't.
Okay.
Yeah. So now it is getting a little bit better. So let us carry on. So what I was going to ask you, it looks like even with the might of Britain, and they have got all the gear to detect everything. It looks like this COVID-19 is actually overwhelmed everybody, because probably now they are concentrating so much onto eradicating the virus, but then again, that is not really for security forces to deal with that. So these guys now, it looks like they are taking advantage of that, because everybody now, everyone now is not paying attention to anything else apart from COVID-19. But going back to this point of the British intelligence forces or intelligence community, they are so much relaxed. Is it because they don't believe that these young boys or lone attackers, as it is known? I asked this before, but I would like you to elaborate on that. Why is it that they are so relaxed and they cannot actually believe that a guy they have been or they have had on their books since 2019? Why can't they do something about that? Or why can't they put them somewhere where they can be, they can also be safe, but that will be also saving the public?
That's a very good question. I hope that my voice is clearer now. Mrs. Joseph, I think what is important to note is that, as I mentioned earlier on, there are so many cases of individuals that the UK government and other agencies are tracing and following up to understand the level of their engagement, especially in terrorist-related activities. So it's almost like a needle in a haystack. But let me touch upon the point that you mentioned about the issue of timing. What we've seen is that terrorist organizations are very good when it comes to taking advantage of chaos, and they turn that chaos into an opportunity for them to strike. As you mentioned, the UK government and so many other states, not just in Europe, in America, of course, in Africa, are focusing their attention on dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic. This is an unprecedented, pandemic which has caused a huge economic damage, but also it has changed the way that we will behave, with between ourselves, as human beings. So the chaos which has been caused by COVID-19, has been seen by terrorist organizations as a perfect opportunity to plan attacks, to conceptualize the way that they can carry out their attacks. So the timing of this attack is very, very significant because it comes at a time when the UK government is just releasing, well, not to use the word releasing, it's just saying to people that you can go back to the streets, you can begin the process of interactions with certain individuals that you choose as your bubble. So it was well timed, Joseph. But what I think is most important is to really understand that if you look at what happened before this attack, which was the Black Lives Matter movement and the protest, this attack, has took the opportunity of people that are protesting for the brutality that occurred in the United States as a result of the officer who killed George. So I think what we have to look at here very importantly is the timing. It was well timed, at the time when there was chaos. And it was impossible, in my opinion. I'm sure that maybe others would differ, for the UK police to be able to deal with it, because that is the nature of asymmetric warfare. Your enemy plans attacks, in an invincible way. So it is not about stopping the attack, from when it happens. It's about trying to deal with the underlying reasons why this young 25-year-old Libyan, has incubated himself to the point where he's decided that he would acquire the kind of capacity and capability to launch an attack on the most vulnerable population. So my opinion, Joseph, is that the UK government needs to do more. And the only thing that they can do is to build trust with the local community, because this is where the answer is. The people that also suffer the most, as you know, is the local community. So it's time to build that trust, Joseph.
Okay, so I know we are having difficulties with the line. I don't know what, because I wanted really to stretch this thing, this conversation up to maybe a half an hour. In your introduction, you said that you are going to mention two things. The triangle and the motivation and attack. Could you just talk about the triangle, just briefly, if you can, maybe within 3 minutes, and then we go to motivation, because those 2 points really needs to be explored, because many people think that the guys, they just get up and do things. without realizing that they have got their networking cells and stuff like that. They have got friends they are discussing all the time. So please, if you could talk about the triangle issue here, let us see what the triangle is in terms of terrorism.
Again, thank you for that. The Otos Triangle, I call it, tells you the exact methodology in terms of how a terrorist attack happens. So if, for example, as we've seen in the case of Reading, where an attack has occurred, you've got to go back to the terror triangle. And that triangle enables you to understand why this individual decided. What is the motivation behind them? Is it ideologically driven, or is it just a criminal mindset individual? So that is why in the beginning of the triangle, you'd have at the top of the triangle the motivation and the ideology. So what are the push and pull factors? What enabled the 25 years old Saadallah Abdullahi to carry out an attack in this particular area? So you've got to look at the motivation, which is one part of the triangle. The bottom left of that triangle looks at what kind of weapon that individual used. So in this case, he used a knife and he caused as much damage as he could. So this again is a copycat that we've seen in many attacks in the West. And this is very different from attacks which have been carried out in Africa, in Nigeria, in Somalia by Al-Shabaab, by the Islamic State of West Africa province. They use more sophisticated weapons to launch their attacks. But what we've seen in Europe is a use of very, easy to acquire weapons, knives, vans, things like that, which are easily obtainable without being detected. So then the last part of the triangle is the nature of the target. And what we've seen is that most individuals select targets depending on the kind of capacity that they have. So you will not see a lone individual launching an attack in a military barracks, with a knife, because he wouldn't survive the next second. So the nature of the target, which is a very soft target in this case, people just, chilling out in the parks, being attacked, by somebody with a knife, tells you that, the individual has selected their target based on the kind of weapon that they've acquired. So this is how the triangle works. And again, in the middle of that triangle, as we spoke about, is the idea of, is the concept of opportunity, the concept of taking your chances. So terrorists would make sure that when they launch their attacks, they take advantage of the timing of the opportunity and, to make sure that they cause maximum casualty, that they can. So that is the concept, Mr. Joseph, of the terror triangle. And all these components, if one of these components is missing, then an attack will not occur. Therefore, what we always say to governments is to make sure that you have all the various components within your state to be able to deal with each of these areas.
Okay, so let us look at motivation.
Yes. Now, so again, as I mentioned, in terms of motivation, what you're looking at is how do you come up with a counter ideology, that what makes people to become radicalized in the first place. So, for example, in Europe, you would hear people talking about foreign policy. You would hear people talking about discrimination. So you would have all these issues of, people that have, see their government as, not accommodating of their culture. So you would have all these various differential motivational factors. In Africa, for example, you would hear of people being radicalized because they are poor, or because they are uneducated. So that is the area of motivation that you deal with when it comes to how do you then try and address all these various dynamics. But one thing which is very clear is governments are supposed to address this on individual basis, because people join terrorist organizations differently. I could join for one reason, somebody else would join for another reason. So you've got to make sure that you tailor your intervention activities to suit that. The second part of it again is the capability. How do you acquire your capability? And we often say that simply because somebody has an ideology doesn't necessarily mean that they have the capacity to carry out an attack. So it is the role of the law enforcement to ensure that individuals that are radicalized do not have access to weapons. And the Western, the European states, the UK has done a lot of work to deny individuals the access to certain types of weapons. And that is why you would see that most attacks that occur in Europe or in the UK, for example, are attacks which are carried out by individuals who can easily access weapons like knives, like vans, or homemade IEDs. So these are the kind of low-level attacks that you would see in Europe. But it's contrary to Africa, where you would see individuals carrying suicide-bound very improvised explosive devices, large AK-47 and stuff like that. So that is the level of capability. And again, what we have found is that the level that an individual or a group, is armed will determine their target. So in this case of the 25 years old Saadallah Abdullahi in Reading, he launched an attack with a knife on a weaker target, on a soft target, on a vulnerable target, because he doesn't expect any resistance from that that target. But if he were to carry out this attack, in a military base, he wouldn't succeed to do that. So you've got to understand that the ideology, the capabilities are always, there to indicate to you the kind of target that an individual that would launch. So, Mr. Joseph, this is some kind of a breakdown of these various levels of the terror triangle, and how it reflects to the case of the Reading attack.
Okay, so we are drawing to a close now. Our time is
Yes.
our time is coming to an end. But I want to ask this question. I don't know whether you might have an answer to it. Just imagine. Say, for example, you have spoken about motivation and the triangle, but let us assume that this young guy from Libya is just motivated by erratic emotions because he feels he's away from home, and he misses his parents, and he can see people are enjoying themselves. All he wants is just to disrupt that enjoyment without an intention of terrorizing people. Now, suppose if it was a person with a different name, not with an Arabic name, would it be classified as a terrorist attack, you think?
I think what people need to make a differentiation with is not the individual, is the nature of the attack. But also the motivation behind the attack may be important in some aspect. But what we've got to understand is to make a difference between the act of terrorism and the motivation behind it. So even if the motivation were different, the nature of the act, could still be an act of terrorism. So, it is almost wrong sometimes when governments say an attack is not terror related, because, terrorism itself is nothing to do with, the motivation. It's more to do with, the nature of the attack. It creates terror. It frightens people. It leads to political changes. It leads to economic changes. It leads to social changes. So if an attack has that kind of an impact, irrespective of why that individual carried out that attack, I would still say that it is a terror-related attack, irrespective of whether that individual comes from an African background, or from an Islamic background, or from a white background. It doesn't really make a difference to the people that are victims. of that attack. It doesn't make a difference to the people who, would have psychological impact to that attack. But, for the purpose of specification, the United Kingdom has what you call the Joint Terrorism Analysis Center. They call them JTAC. They would be coming through these individuals' background, working in hand with the counterterrorism units to understand whether this attack is related to any major Islamic movement, whether it's Al Qaeda or the Islamic State. They will be working towards that. But my take is this: most of the attacks which are carried out in London, in the United Kingdom, elsewhere in Europe, are mostly inspired attacks. They are not directed attacks. They are not enabled attacks. Enabled attacks and directed attacks, we see them very often in Africa. So what I would be looking for now, Joseph, is to see whether the threat level, in the UK will change from substantial, because it's now at the level of substantial, which means an attack is a strong possibility. So I want to see whether it will move towards severe, which is, an attack is highly likely. But this is going to be the job of the JTAC, as I earlier pointed out. But with the COVID-19 pandemic and the open of the lockdown, don't be surprised, Joseph, that we see a lot of attacks of this nature, copycat attacks, because a lot of people have been radicalized online, and now is the time when they are expressing, their level of radicalization through launching these kind of attacks. So, I hope that African countries can be able to look at these, changes in dynamics and work towards, their national counterterrorism strategies.
Well, okay, our time has come to an end. And as always, David Otto from Global Risk International, thank you very much for that insight. But what I think what we need to do is to revisit this again, because this kind of news is going to go throughout the week. So maybe we have to keep an eye on what is happening. Then as soon as something happens, we are on it. So
thank you.
Okay. So now,
as
you have heard the man is the man who knows everything to do with terrorism, whether it is global, whether it is in Africa. He's the man. David Otto, I'm sure he will be back soon on the screens in the near future. It could be even tomorrow, because there could be something else to talk about. Until then, keep watching this space.